And Paul followed God's direction. Paul didn't really have much choice, did he? After God struck him blind on the road. And we've heard this story before. Saul, whose purpose was to persecute the Christians, and as we heard in our text, was traveling to Damascus to do just that when Jesus spoke to him. And Paul was stunned and amazed and frightened, and who wouldn't be, when all of a sudden you hear a voice saying, "You are persecuting me and my people." And then he stands up and he can't see. People at first light said, but then he just went on into Damascus. And I said, well, would you? If you stood up and you were blind and you were told to go on ahead into the town you were headed to, but with a different purpose, and the people were with you, were going to lead you by the hand, I think we'd all go, right? And they did. And poor Ananias, who was told by God to welcome Saul, who is now called Paul, into his home and to take care of him. And we can imagine Ananias' response, "Is that really you, God? Are you talking to me? You're talking to the wrong person. That guy is coming here to kill me. I'm not going to invite him into my home." And as we heard in the text, he was reassured by God, "I have chosen this person. So do as I ask." And because we know how the story goes, we know that both Paul and Ananias followed God's direction. And hence we have the text for today. Now, Paul's call was not instantly an easy path. He wasn't a popular guy. His reputation was well known as the one who persecuted Christians, not embraced them. And as we heard in that second text, God said, "I will decide the amount for him to suffer to be part of my people." We are told that Paul had to recreate himself from being the feared persecutor to a trusted follower. He had to change his way, and so he wandered for those 12 to 14 years around the countryside of that time, attempting to recreate himself and to meet people where they were at, whether it was in the synagogue and they were rejecting him, or it was out on the roads, to talk to them in ways that they would understand, that they would be willing to listen instead of fear, and eventually come to trust him. And as it turns out, Paul had quite a gift for getting people to listen to him. And we have great evidence of that in Scripture, right? There are 13 letters and epistles that are attributed to Paul that bear witness to his gift for communication and bringing people to see his way. Calls come at different times in our lives and in different ways. We can think that we are going in one direction, as Paul and Ananias, and then find ourselves totally turned around, going in a different direction with a different goal and a different purpose. And as with Paul and Ananias, we sometimes takes us a long time to really get it. You may have had those experiences yourself, and you are thinking, are you talking to me, God? I don't think I don't think I'm the one you want. I mean, have you met me? It comes often as a surprise, and sometimes it feels awkward and messy, as with Paul and Ananias. Even though we are Presbyterians, a calling from God typically does not come neatly and in order that we just ease into. My sermon title for today came from a conversation a little bit ago at First Light when we were talking about call. And one of the folks there said, I have these conversations in my head, and they are nudging me and directing me. And I think, is that really you, God, talking to me? Or am I just talking to myself? Probably, if I asked you to raise your hands, in fact, maybe I will. This is kind of participatory, right? Who has had conversations in their heads where they thought, what in the world is this about? And have you ever thought, is that you, God, talking to me? When I first experienced my call to ministry, I thought I was having weird dreams that continued on for several nights. And I would wake up in the night with the same conversation in my head over and over until I finally started to get it and said, is that really you, God? Okay, I'll follow. Which led to seminary and ordination and being on staff here for about 12 years. And when it was time for me to leave here, I didn't know what would be next. And so I prayed and bargained a little bit with God, because that's what we do, right? I'll go where you send me. But if the truth were known, I really want to stay around my family. Just saying. A few weeks before my last Sunday here, I was having coffee down the street at Starbucks with a clergy friend, Norm Schrum, who had left his position in congregational ministry in Oregon and had moved here to be near family and to follow a call that he was experiencing to hospice chaplaincy. And I remember so clearly that conversation when he suggested that I might want to think about hospice chaplaincy. And I said, oh, no, No, that's all about death and dying. I don't think that's for me. And he said, JoAnn, never say never to God, because you don't know what's coming next. Well, what came next was a phone call from Jackie Kelly at St. Luke's, who had been the head of the clinical pastoral education program. I was part of that program for a year while I was in seminary, and she offered me a spot on the chaplain residency program that was a one-year paid, full-time position. And I thought, okay, I'll be a hospital chaplain. During that year, I had some really difficult training and some really amazing learning, as I was assigned to critical care, adult and pediatric oncology, and part-time in pediatric ICU. And then came that last quarter, and I was a month into it when I got reassigned to, wait for it, St. Luke's Hospice. And I went, what? Really? Oh, this is going to be really long 2 months. And as it turned out, I had a wonderful mentor who I shadowed for a couple of weeks, and then he started giving me my own patients, and I learned quickly that hospice isn't so much about death and dying as it is about living, as it is about living to the fullest that we can until we take that last breath and are born into the new life that God promises us. Who knew that I would fall in love with hospice? Apparently God, right? When I finished my time there, they didn't have an opening for a hospice chaplain, and so I wandered for a couple of days until I got a text from a retired Presbyterian minister I'd done spiritual discernment with. And he said in the text, I had talked to him about my experience in hospice. He said, call my daughter, Kim. She's a social worker at a hospice agency, and they have an opening for a chaplain. So I did. And after 2 interviews, I was 10 days from the time I finished at St. Luke's, I was hired on as a hospice chaplain, where I've been now for nearly 13 years. And then about 4 years ago, I began feeling nudged and pushed and pulled back towards congregational ministry. Having the dreams and having the conversations in the night and saying, is that really you, God? Okay, what is this new thing going to look like? And by the way, if you recall the conversation we had the last time we talked about this, I'd still like to be near my family. About 2 weeks later, I heard about a position that was opening up in McCall at the community church there, and I was encouraged by some people to call and find out about it, and I kept putting it off and pushing it off on my to-do list down to the next day, the next week, until I was told, well, now you did it, so they hired somebody else. And I thought, well, that's because it's not where I was supposed to be. And then out of the blue, I found myself in a conversation with Andrew in his office. He was offering me a position on this staff as a visitation pastor, part-time. And he explained to me all of the things, the expectations, the requirements, the whole process. And then he said, why don't you give it some thought and pray about it, and then let me know your decision. And I can remember, it just gives me goosebumps, sitting there looking at him, and I hear myself saying, my answer is yes. And here I am, 3 years later. And when Andrew welcomed me and told you all that I was coming back on staff, and he said to me, welcome home, JoAnn. It's exactly how it felt. And in some ways it feels like I've never left. Some of you here I've known for a really long time. I never expected to go to seminary or be ordained, and yet the door opened and I walked through, and everything fell into place. I never thought I would be a hospice chaplain, and yet I am. I didn't ever think that I would have the opportunity to be back on this staff, and yet here I am. God's call in our lives comes in different ways, and to minister in different ways that we would never have guessed. Much like Paul, whose life was turned completely around. And he struggled for a while, and I'm sure that he had conversations, as many clergy will admit to if they're honest, conversations with God like, really, God? Is this feeling good to you? Because it's not feeling good to me right now. But he pursued, he persevered, and he went on and became to be a really important person in our text and in our faith. And being called isn't a one-and-done thing. Some of you have been called to different things, I'm sure, to service in the church. And even when you're called to ministry, it's not a one-and-done, because you never know where you're going to end up, whether it's going to be in a church or a hospice agency or a hospital or who knows. Andrew has said here several times that he and Carolyn had never thought that they would be west of the Mississippi. And yet, when they were looking for a new call, Caroline had the experience that led her to say, I think we're supposed to go to that church in Boise. And they were meant to come here. And lucky for us that they listened to God. It's true that God calls us in different forms of ministry, and God's call isn't always to clergy in the church. I work with 45 people in hospice who range from schedulers to RNs and CNAs and administration people and social workers, and fill in the blank. And if you ask them, they would tell you. If you say to them, why did you choose a job in hospice? They would say, well, I didn't choose it. It wasn't a conscious decision. I was drawn here. They might not use the same words, although some do. I felt called to this work. I felt pulled in this direction. An RN that I work with said, I always wanted to be a labor and delivery RN. And I was for 3 years. And then I was in a conversation where somebody randomly was talking about hospice. And it stayed in my head. And I couldn't stop thinking about it. And suddenly, on my phone, popped up a job posting for a hospice position. And here I am. And I thought, is that you, God? At my daughter's wedding, I met a man from Scottsdale, Arizona, who had a really successful law practice. And when he found out I was a minister, people want to tell you lots of stories. Sometimes it's as simple as, my grandma was Presbyterian. This guy wanted to share, in his words, the weird dreams that he was having about working with people, migrants who had been in this country for most all of their lives and were productive, working people who were trying really hard to get permanent citizenship or at least a permanent green card, and were having a lot of problem. He said he tried to ignore those dreams, but they continued until one day he found himself sitting in a courtroom, getting ready to give a final argument for a lawsuit where two very wealthy people were suing each other for who had the right to even more wealth. And he was sitting there and he heard a voice in his head that said, you could be helping poor people who just want to be able to stay in the country they've known as their home and to raise their families here. It really struck him, and he, not too long after that, closed his law practice. And today he still does pro bono work for people who can't afford attorneys. God calls us in lots of different ways. I had somebody speak to me a couple months ago and say, I don't know why I keep thinking about this, but I really feel like I want to do something in hospice. Do you have volunteers? And I said, actually, we do. They now visit people as a hospice volunteer in facilities. They help lead Bible study. And they visit people in their homes who are in the last chapter of their lives. God calls us in lots of different ways. You don't have to close your law practice. You don't have to go to seminary and be ordained and be moved around the country. That isn't a requirement of a call. A call is for all of us. It is for all of us where God is nudging us and encouraging us and speaking to us. If we listen, we might think that it's a weird dream or a random idea, or why am I thinking about that? When it's really God saying, follow me. Do you remember that Judy Blume book? Are you there, God? It's me, Margaret. In that book, Margaret said, God, are you really there? I've looked for you in synagogues and churches and cathedrals, and I don't find my answer. Well, God doesn't always call us in the church. Although sometimes it's true, because all of you who raised your hand saying, I have volunteered here, is probably not because you were sitting over your coffee one morning saying, I've got all this time on my hands, maybe I should do something at the church. And maybe it was, and maybe it was God saying, you've got a lot of time on your hands. There's plenty to do at the church. God's call isn't always to being clergy in the church, for sure, and it isn't always to be clergy at all. It comes in random ways, in ways that we would never think of, in ways that we initially question. And, as in the Dr. Seuss book, Oh, the Places You'll Go, if you will be open to accept that the conversations in your head are really God calling you to some form of ministry and service. And if you accept that that is really God calling, then oh, the places you'll go, and the people you'll meet, and the people you'll serve. Sometimes in your own faith community, sometimes in your own neighborhood, sometimes around the corner, in this community outside of our walls. When you accept that it really is God, God is saying, come on, let's do this together. You don't have to do it alone. We're in it together. Thanks be to God. Amen.